The biggest surprise this year for all parties involved concerning gaming, not least of which for Larian itself, has been Baldur's Gate 3. In retrospect, this does not seem at all too surprising, but it should be. Expectations going into Baldur's Gate 3, as stated by Sven Vinke himself, the CEO of Larian, were modest. He had reckoned it would do better than Divinity Original Sin 2, but not by much. Lo and behold, at its peak in August of this year, the game's player count had reached close to 875,000 concurrent players, exceeding the wildest dreams of Lord Vinke and the aficionados of RPGs across the world. And it has been a smash hit, capturing the interest of gaming demographics far beyond traditional CRPG enthusiasts, and most recently BG3 won multiple Golden Joystick Awards. This is all rather incredible, obviously, but it raises real questions as to the future of CRPGs. What does the future hold? Is Baldur's Gate 3 the beginning of a revolution or renaissance in CRPGs? Now, I've discussed this to some degree in prior videos, but in this video I'd like to take a proper stab at the topic. Now, at the outset, to be precise, when I'm talking about RPGs, I'm specifically talking about CRPGs. There are many games that are put in this genre that have relatively little to do with other games in the genre. Some examples of this would be Cyberpunk 2077 and the Witcher series, which are referred to as RPGs. However, I would classify them as narrative adventures because they are fairly linear, and although they have some RPG elements, they do not have the branching narratives that are common to CRPGs, and the supremely detailed system of combat, races, classes, stats, and other related things that are much less represented in such games. Then you have games such as Skyrim that are much more akin to action RPGs, because their systems tend to be very light, and there's greater linearity in the story and options available. So what does this mean? Specifically, I'm referring to classic isometric RPGs such as BG1 and 2, later games such as the Pillars of Eternity series, Tyranny, and even Divinity. These types of games are some of the games that people most readily associate with the CRPG genre, and unsurprisingly, they're not terribly popular, at least by current day metrics compared to other games such as Gaijin Impact, FIFA, or even Diablo 4. Now, Baldur's Gate 3 is a CRPG, but it also does things other games don't. And Baldur's Gate 3 is an interesting case, because Baldur's Gate 3 presents something to the player that offers something for everyone, and enough of that something such that they can become immersed in the game. For some people that like to calculate numbers and tease out the intricacies of builds and damage, Baldur's Gate 3 offers something to them, and this is especially true in light of the recent Honor mode. But for people who are less interested in number crunching and combat, and more interested in, say, for lack of a better word, story in the sense of drama and character interactions, Baldur's Gate 3 offers something to them. For lore geeks of D&D, Baldur's Gate 3 offers a direct and interactive experience with many of the creatures and people one had only read about in the past, and had only rarely seen on the screen. In short, Baldur's Gate 3 is the ultimate generalist CRPG, which allows it to bypass many barriers of entry and attract as wide an audience as possible. As I've briefly mentioned cinematic cutscenes, so far so good. But what does that mean for the CRPG genre more broadly? Well, it means that in order to capture a broad audience, you need to appeal to the average gamer. As let's be perfectly honest, most people are simply not autistic enough to get through all the numbers and complexities of a Pathfinder game such as Wrath of the Righteous, or even a more old-school game such as Baldur's Gate 1 or 2, for similar reasons, as well as for aesthetic ones. Absolute classics, but nonetheless extremely niche classics that only appeal to a certain audience. And my interactions with people who are either young or have had little experience with CRPGs have taught me that such games as the original Baldur's Gate titles simply do not appeal to newcomers, or young people more generally. A big part of this is that traditional CRPGs are steadfastly isometric, at least the most popular and lauded ones are, and this seems to be a big turnoff for young people and CRPG newcomers. Baldur's Gate 3, on the other hand, is only partially isometric, as the cinematic cutscenes and importance of verticality, as well as the ability to shift the camera to more favorable angles, do not produce the same effect and perception that a Baldur's Gate 2 or Kingmaker might. And this tells us that the popularity of Baldur's Gate 3 has, at least in part, more to do with the innovation, in some sense, than continuity. You have no idea how many times I've heard people complain that no matter how much they want to play the original Baldur's Gate games, that because of the purely isometric perspective, they simply can't get into it. There's just no way around the fact that these cutscenes were probably decisive factors, if not the decisive factors, in building up the popularity of Baldur's Gate 3. And you don't have to take my word for it. Believe it or not, there's a gaming demographic that plays Baldur's Gate 3 primarily as a romance sim, or views it as a soap opera. But in order to be able to perceive the game as such, the game first needs to have the requisite components that allow for such a playstyle. Larian clearly spent a great deal of time and money on voice acting, motion capture, and the details of many cutscenes in the game. More than they had ever had before in previous games, or in any other traditional CRPG. All these cutscene elements allow for a completely different take on CRPGs, inspiring the romance sim effect, fanfiction, and a primary focus on characters, their interactions, and feelings towards the protagonist, whether Tav, Dark Urge, or any of the origin characters. And because of this, there's a large fanfiction since both before and after the game's release. Astarion in particular has been one of the most popular characters among certain demographics, and it reminds me of the way Alistair from Dragon Age Origins was popular, and that game was for its time full of cinematic cutscenes. So we simply cannot underestimate the importance of this addition, which drew untold numbers of players into the game. And directly related to this is the heavy emphasis on characters and their origins. Whether you play as the origins or not, you inevitably end up getting deeply involved in the companion stories. And whilst it is true that virtually all CRPGs worth their salt and companion stories, the combination of cinematics, companions, and the stress on their origin and attempt to resolve their internal conflicts is something that many CRPGs don't do to the same degree, at least with that combination. So in reality, although Baldur's Gate 3 may very well get Game of the Year, and indeed has achieved something that no classic CRPG ever has before, it is far more due to the fact that it deviates enormously from the classic formula that many people are familiar with, rather than reinforcing classic CRPG features and elements. To be sure, BG3 is a CRPG, and has many such classic qualities, but that is not the strength it plays upon when it sells as well as it does, nor is it the source of its appeal, as these things are at best neutral in the eyes of many. This is best encapsulated with a comment I left under a video made by the very large German gaming channel GameStar, to which one of the responses I see time and time again was written, the question being as to whether or not Baldur's Gate 3 has begun a new trend of interest in CRPGs, with my response being the following: not at all. The reason BG3 is popular is because of production value and cinematic cutscene. There are a lot of great old CRPGs that never appeal to most people. Pillars of Eternity, Pathfinder Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous, Tyranny, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, among others. What's the difference? Less money put into them, and purely isometric, without voice-acted cutscenes. And one gentleman's response to this was the following: yep, that's exactly why I played BG3, and not all the other games you mentioned. I'm a fan of KOTOR and Dragon Age. I'll sum them up like that. And it just so happened that dialogue that is voice-acted, where you can really see the characters, has become a minimum requirement for me. The depth of BG3 clearly makes it a better game than KOTOR or Dragon Age, but I still would have loved to have played it with a little less depth. Bringing depth and presentation together is a mammoth task. If a studio had to choose 1 or 2 points to cut back on, for me personally, it would be depth. Then you have something like Dragon Age again, and that would be completely okay for me. Now, I cannot tell you how often I've read and seen comments like this, and therefore, the real question is whether or not wealthy publishers with large studios are willing to create CRPGs like BG3 to tantalize and attract people that seek such content, with a heavy emphasis on cutscenes and cinematics. Will EA with BioWare, Ubisoft, and all of Microsoft's developers work on such games? I doubt it, as this is not merely a question of resources, but also a question of developers, and above all, leadership. Speaking plainly, Sven Vincke is the lifeblood and purpose behind Larian, and without him, you probably would have never gotten a game of the caliber of Baldur's Gate 3. No one would have had the vision and drive to make a game like Baldur's Gate 3. And the sad truth is that there's already been a CRPG renaissance in recent years, starting in the mid-2010s, with games such as Pillars of Eternity, Divinity, Tyranny, and Pathfinder, which all serve to revitalize the genre for many people. And as far as I'm concerned, not every game has to be like BG3. There are many elements, for example, in Wrath of the Righteous, as I'm a bit odd as I don't assign premium value to cutscenes as much as I do other features in CRPGs. Inasmuch as Baldur's Gate 3 has awakened interest in the genre, I am indeed grateful for that. But I think ultimately, CRPGs can stand on their own. They do not need in their totality to become a massive AAA phenomenon or success in order to enjoy a new life cycle of appreciation, and I for one am perfectly fine with that. In fact, trying to popularize them too much might lead to too many deviations from the formulas people appreciate in the genre. Of course, this is not detract whatsoever from Baldur's Gate 3 or Larian. Rather, it points to the fact that Baldur's Gate 3's success is to some degree disconnected from the general CRPG audience and genre, and appeals to a far broader audience for the reasons I cited, almost entirely due to voice acting and cinematic cutscenes. In the end, I see neither revolution nor renaissance, but I think both iterations of CRPGs can coexist beside each other and stand on their own. Thanks for watching. Before I go, I'd like to invite you to my Discord server, where you can discuss Baldur's Gate 3 and other RPGs with like-minded people. And as always, thank you for tuning in, and if you like my content, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified of my videos, as it all really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.